Downtown Burbank, Thurrakas. That is actually what it says, and I have to say. Running for 259 episodes over the course of 13 seasons, King of the Hill is an absolutely classic animated sitcom, but the slice-of-life comedy about a Texan family is usually spoken about with more reverence paid to the fact that it's a sitcom than paid to the fact that it's animated. As a matter of fact, I couldn't tell you how many times I've seen people ask why King of the Hill needs to be animated. Admittedly, it's a question I've wondered myself at times. It doesn't have the interdimensional travel of Rick and Morty, the high-concept absurdity of South Park, or a character who's literally just a horse. But just because it's not flashy doesn't mean King of the Hill doesn't rely heavily on the necessity of its animation. In fact, the show would never have attained the same level of success if it had been live action. Let's look at all the reasons that King of the Hill needs to be animated. Number 1. Cinematography. Cinematography isn't a word you typically think of in the same sentence as animated sitcom, or hell, even in the same sentence as live-action sitcom, until the past few years at least. Situational comedies have traditionally existed in a world of 3 cameras on a studio backlot set with characters cheated out to the audience resembling a stage play. This look's been mimicked by animation as far back as shows like The Flintstones, and as recently as Bob's Burgers. This flat design minimizes the number of costly backgrounds that need to be drawn and greatly reduces complex angles that you might see the characters. King of the Hill, on the other hand, was like nothing else when it premiered in 1997. Though the location was the quiet suburban sprawl of Arlington, Texas, the way the show is shot is more in common with a Coen Brothers movie than it does with The Simpsons. Take a look at the staging of this simple dinner scene and how elegant it is. An outdoor establishing shot, character close-ups and reverse shots, cutting all through the table with a clear line of action. The complexity of the scene was unheard of in an era of 3-camera sitcoms. King of the Hill's contemporaries like Friends, Frasier, Just Shoot Me, and even Seinfeld rarely dared to put a character's back to the camera. It wasn't until shows like Malcolm in the Middle and Arrested Development normalized the notion of a single camera shooting that shows began to look this good. King of the Hill's cinematography wasn't just for innovation's sake either. There was an obvious practical value to the cost. Cameras, sets, locations, scouting crews, they all cost a lot of money. Peak TV means shows cost more than they ever have, and while animation's not cheap either, creating reusable backgrounds and elements was a cost-saving measure that made all of this possible long before any other show was doing it. Number 2. Voice cast. Though Hank, Peggy, and Bobby stand front and center, King of the Hill is a show with an impossibly huge cast. There are 188 named characters with dedicated pages on the King of Hill wiki, and that's not even including the one-off incidental unnamed characters. A live-action show would require virtually every single one of those roles to be a different person, or for the actors to undergo expensive and time-consuming facial reconstructive surgery between roles, which is surprisingly not a thing that a lot of actors are game for. I don't know why. As other animated shows like The Simpsons have shown us, an impossibly huge cast is nothing that a team of extremely talented voice actors can't handle. While not as frequently lauded as The Simpsons for their versatility, the King of the Hill cast tackles an amazing amount of characters. Creator Mike Judge obviously handles Hank, but also juggles Boomhauer, Stuart Dooley, and a bunch of other uncredited roles. Toby Huss has Cotton Hill, Joe Jack, and admittedly, and not the greatest move, Con. Then Dave Herman plays pretty much every other speaking role who's not one of the main cast, like Gilbert Dautrive, Jimmy Witcher, Buckley, Jimmy Carter, Alien Urine Salesman, Dolphin Trainer, Muscular Man, and Frisbee Hippie. The ability to rely on this pool of incredible actors to give characters personality and life means that the show didn't have to get lucky with their casting every time that they wanted to gamble on a new character. Would the show work with just Hank or Boomhauer? No. But I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing a show that's nothing but Boomhauer, and that is also what I would call it, nothing but Boomhauer. I am going to call Fox in the past right now when that was a relevant idea. Number 3, guest stars. Yes, when you hear guest stars and cartoons, you've gotta mention The Simpsons. But in the same breath, you've gotta balk at how the show virtually only includes cameos so Grandpa Simpson can yell out things like, "I love you, Lady Gaga," which is totally real, look it up. And also, that was a perfect Grandpa Simpson's impression. I'm very impressed with myself. King of the Hill, however, gives guest stars a far greater gift than an awkward geriatric shout-out. It gives them actual roles. Instead of providing weird, yellow, bastardized versions of celebrities as themselves, King of the Hill actually uses actors' acting talents and gives the audience an opportunity to see folks in a way that they've never seen them before. Where else can you see Michael Keaton getting crushed in a pig murdering machine, or have former Texas Governor Ann Richards date someone like Bill? Would you prefer to have a version of Brad Pitt saying, "I'm Brad Pitt, but yellow," or get to see Brad Pitt doing a weird, horny, nonsensical Boomhauer impression? The show was able to score a wide range of talents: Matthew McConaughey, Snoop Dogg, Johnny Depp, Alan Rickman, Sally Field, Will Ferrell, and that's just naming a few. And all of this is because asking an actor to pop in front of a mic for a few minutes isn't such a big lift. International superstar Brad Pitt probably never got out of his pajamas the day he jumped into an episode of King of the Hill. And the other great thing is that when a character actor would rather stay in their pajamas than reprise a role, it's super easy to replace them without the audience ever really noticing. Characters like Chris Rock's Buddha Sack was later replaced by Phil Lamar, and Enrique was played at different points by Danny Trejo, Eloy Casadois, and Dave Herman. If you change even one face in a live action show, the audience they lose their shit and never forgive you.
Clever fellow. Can't argue with his logic.
Number 4, longevity. Let's talk a little bit more about that cast. It's the dream of every sitcom to return to a perfect zero at the end of every episode. Plots moving forward and characters developing are the enemies of consistent joke writing, and nothing's worse than a show that forces its premise for years too long. I mean, there comes a point where it's a little weird that all the friends in Friends are like 58 years old, still roommates, and they've all at some point been married to each other, including the monkey. King of the Hill ran for 13 seasons, which means a live-action 11-year-old Bobby Hill would have been 24 by the time the show ended, which would maybe have changed some of the elements of his awkward middle school kid plotlines, or made his tenure as a racist shock comedian completely abhorrent instead of disappointingly misguided. Pamela Adlon, Bobby's actor, was able to play the part from ages 31 to 44 without her voice ever notably changing it. Mike Judge and Fox were free to doom Bobby to awkward adolescence for a literal eternity if they chose to do so. And that's just one character. And it doesn't mean that nothing changes on the show. When the showrunners do want a character to grow or develop, it can be as simple as recasting a voice. When Joseph hits puberty, his voice actor transitions from Brittany Murphy to the dulcet tones of other early 2000s powerhouse, Breckin Meyer. So really, it's the best of both worlds. King of the Hill didn't have to move things forward, but when they did, it could be at exactly the pace that the showrunners needed. Which leads us to number 5, control. Try as you might, you'll never get a real-life character or real-life location to look exactly like it does in your head, unless you just draw it. And I mean, not me, but somebody who's like good at drawing. It may be almost too obvious to say, but animation afforded Mike Judge and team unprecedented control over every part of their show that would otherwise be left to chance and circumstance. Whether scheduling, casting availability, things like clothing sizes for costuming, set design, the amount of versioning and approvals in animation means that the show was able to do complicated things. Things as complicated as sending the hills to an intricately designed Japan, or making it snow in Texas where you'd never expect it. Or something as bizarre as making a local fast casual restaurant look exactly like the downtown Burbank Fuddruckers. I mean, hey, if you're an animator spending too much of your time at Fuddruckers, you'd probably be cramming it into your work wherever you get the chance too. So props, whoever did that weird thing. Beyond this, character direction can be controlled to an unbelievable degree. Sure, voice actors leave a little something to chance, but animators were supplied intensive style guidelines that helped to define the show's extremely considered look. Don't let King of the Hill's grounded look fool you. They thought of everything and made it a rule. The exact shape of Hank's pupils, interior car lights turning on at nighttime, even the time on Hank's watch accurately reflecting the time it's supposed to be on the show. That boy might not be right, but literally everything else on the show is. I'm not gonna try and do a Hank Hill impression. As much as I like the show, I can't. Don't make me. Number 6, extravagance. Yes, that's not hyperbolic at all. And last, but about as far away from least as we could get, is the all-important element of scale. The show is about small-town life and isn't actually that small. Consider what the stunt budget would be if they did this cartoon in real life. They dropped Peggy Hill out of a plane. They drove a semi down a steep, winding mountain. They ran Hank across an active racetrack, smashed a truck with a train, and had multiple car chases, not to mention the time they blew up an entire Walmart-sized store. King of the Hill had to be animated because, well, it had to be. It may have been grounded in our own reality, but the specific vision Mike Judge had left room for error that was narrower than Hank's urethra. You thought I would get through this whole video without mentioning that? Not a chance. Not a chance, my friend. I'm constantly thinking about it. It's a good show. It had to be animated. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed that episode, the best way by far to support Dorkly is to sign up for Dropout. Every month for less than the price of, I don't know, like a comic book and a half, you get Dorkly shows a week early, you get exclusive access to the Dropout Discord where you can talk to us about your favorite comic book and a half, you get exclusive shows like Dimension 20 and Troopers, which are both so funny and so good. So head over to dropout.tv, sign up for the free trial, get on that Discord, and I'll tell you how that comic book ends. Ends with a cliffhanger. That's a spoiler.